If you've ever taken a history class at school, you probably know the general story of how humans created what we would call civilization. It's usually explained in a pretty simple process. We were once primitive cavemen who were hunting and gathering. Life was super hard and we were living day to day, barely having enough to survive. But then, suddenly, around 12,000 years ago, people discovered agriculture, and this revolutionized the way that people lived, going from nomadic hunting and gathering to sedentary farming communities. Then, somehow, through something food surplus, something urbanization, and something division of labor, governments with taxes, laws, militaries, hierarchies, and religious institutions formed, with prominent examples being Mesopotamia, China, and Egypt. The issue and I think a lot of people have with this narrative, is that it doesn't really explain the specifics of this transition from foragers to farmers, and the evolution of human social organization. Rather, it kind of just lists off some things that happened without presenting any in-depth analysis of these events or developments. And in retrospect, kind of takes some of these events for granted. Like, how did humans organize themselves back in the hunter-gatherer days? Why did social hierarchies develop in the first place? And why did states with centralized governments form? My goal with this video is to clear up a lot of the mystery surrounding this topic, about the history of human organization, and the transition from foraging to farming. A topic that most people have a general idea about but don't really know the specifics of, especially in regards to the whys and the hows. More specifically, I will analyze archaeological sites from the ancient Middle East and apply those discoveries to tell a story of how human society evolved. To start a journey of how humans created the first states and what we would recognize as civilization, we have to go way back. And stop. Okay, we begin our journey in the year 20,000 BC, and I'll just give you a quick overview of the world. This period is what is known as the Ice Age. Mammoths and saber-toothed tigers were still running around. Large sheets of ice covered many areas of the northern hemisphere. The world was more arid than it is now. Sea levels were much lower, and most importantly, for the sake of our video, humans were also present. Now, during this time, there were no states. That wouldn't happen for another 15,000 years or so. So how did people organize themselves, you may ask? And to that, I present to you the band. Extended family units, called bands, of around 15 to 40 individuals would be a typical way humans organize themselves during this time. These bands would have been highly nomadic, traveling to different places throughout the year in accordance to what would have given them easiest access to food. For example, in the wet season, they could move to intercept a migration of elk, while in the dry season, they could move into the forest, gathering various wild plants and hunting small animals. During this time, there is also contact between bands of families, usually during events like animal migrations or a certain fruit ripening. Different bands could work together to take down larger game or harvest together, working for mutual benefit. Other times, they would bicker and fight, but due to the low population density of the world at the time, conflict could usually be resolved by fleeing. Meeting other bands also proved essential for marriage or partner selection. Since members of the same band were largely related, they would avoid marrying within the band, instead opting to marry outside of the band. During the aforementioned events where different bands would meet each other, it would be common for bands to make marriage agreements between younger males and females of their respective families. This would typically be done by sending a woman to go live with the man's family. Their children would subsequently be members of the father's band. This is what is known as agnatic, or I guess in plain English, male-sided line of descent, which would be the most common type for human bands of the time. Perhaps shocking to many people is that these bands were largely egalitarian, with the greatest social divisions being gender and age rather than some sort of prehistoric class structure. This egalitarian structure is also seen in the band's absence of a leader, with the closest semblance to some leader being an older member of the group, seen to have a lot of wisdom. Even then, this elder could hardly be considered a leader, as decisions still had to be undertaken by the group as a whole, rather than something dictated by an individual. This egalitarianism extended past the social organization of such bands, but also their lifestyle. Due to the lack of food preservation technology of the time, hoarding food was wholly impractical, and successful hunts were shared and eaten by the community as soon as possible. But technology was not the only thing holding this egalitarian model together. It is also kinship. Since the band was of one family, it would be greatly incentivized to help each other out instead of being greedy. This band type of societal organization was not only present during the time period we were investigating, but it was the primary means of social organization since the dawn of mankind. In fact, similar systems of organization can be seen in other primates, like chimpanzees. An example of a band type society would be the populations of the Kambaran culture, which existed in the Levant during this time period. Most excavations of Kambaran sites seem to indicate an average population size of 15 people per group. One site of the Kambaran culture called Ohalatu is exceptionally well preserved, as it was submerged in the Sea of Galilee after being burned, allowing us to paint a very good picture of their lifestyle. Ohalatu is a campsite consisting of 3 basic huts, all of them made of brushwood. Throughout the year, the campsite's inhabitants would oscillate between a lifestyle of eating nuts, grains, berries, and fish surrounding a lake, while presumably living at the site of Ohalatu, and shifting to a lifestyle of going upland and hunting game and collecting more grains from the drier lands during other parts of the year. It is important to note that there is no evidence of year-round habitation of the site, as there are no spaces for storage of grains or other foods you'd expect if this was the case. Furthermore, the foundation of some of these huts seem to have been rebuilt several times, suggesting cycles of habitation and abandonment rather than permanent settlement. But environmental changes in the Earth's climate was about to change much of the human way of living. Fast forward some 13,000 years to the year 12,000 BC, and the world is starting to change. The long period of cold and arid climate of the Earth was beginning to warm up towards the end of the Pleistocene, or the Ice Age. What this meant for the prehistoric hunter-gatherer bands was an abundance of new plants and animals for them to feed off of. In fact, this abundance was so great that some bands living in particularly plentiful regions decided to start settling down or semi-settle down. Previously, in the harsh climate of the Ice Age, these bands could not sustain a large population, as the amount of food a given band could acquire was severely limited by the arid conditions of the region. This meant that even when a band could achieve a higher population, it would more than likely split off into multiple bands to venture into different areas to collect enough food. The lack of food was precisely the reason why we did not see more sophisticated or complicated versions of human organization, as it limited the scale that any band could achieve. However, now with temperatures higher and the amount of wildlife increasing, hunting and gathering in each unit of land could feed more people. Furthermore, many developments in food preservation was also made. Examples would include smoking, drying, and salting meat, increasing a time to spoil from days to months. What this meant for communities living in places close to a diverse selection of environments like rivers, woodland, and steppe was that they no longer needed to maintain a highly nomadic lifestyle to survive. That's right, the hunter-gatherers were actually living sedentary lifestyles before the so-called agricultural revolution. We can imagine a band that settles down in one location. They can organize a large hunting of a certain animal during their migration, immediately salting and drying the meat for storage in their settlement. During the following months, light foraging and eating the preserved meat could work for their sustenance, maybe supplemented by fishing by a river. Then they could harvest all the wild grains, which can be stored for many months, only to be ground and eaten at will. This way, in ideal conditions, the band could reside in a single village year-round. This exact phenomenon was seen at the Natufian site of Tel Abu Huraira, a permanent village founded around 11,000 BC, which has a population in the hundreds. It is theorized that the founders of Abu Huraira decided on a sedentary lifestyle because of the migration of gazelle. By organizing mass hunts of gazelle during the migration, they could then immediately process the meat and hide, as well as other resources for storage. This large source of food and material would have been too burdensome to bring around if they chose to stick to their older nomadic way of living. Thus, it was actually more practical for them to settle down. This new phenomenon of humans switching from nomadism to sedentism, largely fueled by the abundance of wild food sources due to the warming climate, created the conditions necessary for greater population density. This population density meant that the previously band-level organizations of society no longer worked, as instead of working and living only with you and your immediate family members, people in villages numbering in the hundreds would often need to collaborate and live close to people of other families. To hold this new and more complex society together, a more sophisticated level of organization emerged: the tribe. A tribe, in the simplest of terms, is a collection of families or bands with some sort of kinship or common element. For instance, let us imagine the Wadug tribe, which consists of 300 people. Within the Wadug tribe, there exist 10 separate bands or clans, each numbering around 30 people. All the 10 bands of the Wadug tribe speak the same language, hold the same religious beliefs, and have some sort of blood relationship with one another through generations of intermarriage. Each of the 10 bands operates independently in daily operations. That is, they hunt in separate parties, grind their own wild grain, and live in their own clusters of huts. But all the bands share some buildings with larger equipment like large milling stones. Additionally, they collaborate with each other during times of large animal migrations to maximize their collective food production. It is also common for different bands within the tribe to fight amongst each other. However, if a foreign clan were to ever threaten them, they would all unite and fight them without challenge. This leads nicely into the next topic, which is conflict. The introduction of tribal societies usually means the introduction of warfare on a much grander scale. And unlike their band-organized predecessors, they did not have an easy way out of this conflict. In band-level societies, their small size made them highly mobile, making fleeing an easy affair, whereas tribal-level societies have populations in the hundreds or even thousands, meaning a possible retreat or escape attempt would be much harder. Furthermore, band-level societies had very little investment in their land, unlike their tribal counterparts, which had cleared lands to make villages and presumably house the graves of their ancestors within their territory as well. They could not simply run away. Instead, this type of environment fosters tension to brew over into what we recognize as war. Now that we learned much about the developments of humans and how they organize themselves during this time period, what exactly happened during this time with regard to agriculture? Well, the short answer is that people didn't feel the need to practice agriculture, so they largely did. There's good evidence to suggest that after the rapid warming of the earth during the late Pleistocene, the same time which we just examined, the spread of wild versions of wheat and rye was quite expansive in the Near East. Furthermore, there is abundance of other food sources like fish and large mammals, making something like agriculture kind of unnecessary. Agriculture itself is also not an easy process, especially without the pesticides and fertilizers we have today. In fact, in any given year of planting, an ancient farmer can expect half of the plants to die before the harvest. This meant that in order to produce an efficient harvest, farmers would need to arduously tend to their crops, regularly picking out weeds, whilst also digging irrigation canals to places with insufficient rainfall. So the reason these tribal societies did not immediately pick up agriculture was not that they had no idea how. Obviously, these prehistoric peoples understood farming, as in, if you plant some seeds, they'll grow out. But there just wasn't a good enough reason to practice static farming, that is farming in a single plot permanently, especially when they have so many easier alternatives to get food. This all changed though during a cooling period called the Younger Dryas, which took place at around 10,000 BCE. Making the previously lush climates at the end of the Ice Age arid once more. What this meant for the humans, which had just organized themselves into more concentrated tribes, was that the once plentiful food, which provided the basis for their lifestyle, was deprived. This development forced these tribes into two paths. One path was to disband the tribal system, returning to a life of band-based nomadic hunting and gathering to survive, abandoning their villages in the process. The other path was that of agriculture. This second group of tribesmen would find wild wheats and rye that produced high amounts of grain, bring them close to their settlement, and begin permanently farming them. In effect, beginning what we would know as the agricultural revolution. The goal of this was pretty simple. They needed to concentrate the food supply closer to their dwellings, allowing them to keep their tribal sedentary way of social organization. During this time, humans also began domesticating wild ancestors of modern goats, sheep, and pigs, as ready supplies of protein and fats. These animals were especially useful, as goats and sheep could eat grass, which obviously humans could not, and eventually humans could eat them, essentially converting inedible food into edible food. Similarly, pigs could wander into forests and dig up various plants and fruits, which humans couldn't find, serving a similar function to the sheep and goats. Once humans brought their domesticated animals into the cultivated fields, it also created a positive feedback loop. Early farmers discovered that the manure from their domesticated animals made the soil more fertile, and the planting much more successful. Then, from their successful harvest, they could feed even more livestock, again increasing their caloric output. With this being said though, due to the arid climate during the Younger Dryas, farming is made more difficult, and those tribes pursuing a sedentary way of life in permanent farming villages would have had a hard time increasing their population. This would again change in approximately 1,500 years, with a sudden spike in the global temperatures at the end of the Younger Dryas. During this time, global temperatures increased by some 7 degrees Celsius, in perhaps as little as a couple decades, making the temperature comparable to modern day. What this meant for those villages who were practicing agriculture was a more stable and more bountiful source of food, allowing tribal villages to swell in population, and their societies to subsequently increase in complexity, eventually forming the basis for what we would call the first states. With that, this concludes my first part of my two-part series on this topic. So far, we have seen the journey of humans from hunter-gatherers to farmers and from bands to larger tribes. Next time, I'll discuss what factors led to the creation of states in the first place. And spoilers, the answer is not just that their populations increased.